There it is. I'm going to start recording, and we'll start with Dan. I'm sure you're all very familiar with Daniel already because he's our conference organizer, but he's also a writer, producer, researcher with interest in screen theories and histories, productions, and he's a lecturer at RMIT University. So Dan and everyone, I will put a 2-minute warning in the chat when we're getting towards that time. All right, so I will pass over to you, Dan. Thank you.
Thanks, Joymi. Thanks, everyone. You've only got to put up with me for another 15 minutes and then I'll shut up for the rest of the day. So thank you. I'm just going to share. Hopefully we can all see that. Cool. There are two parts to any machine learning application. First, you use a particular data set to train the system. So for instance, if you want to create a deep fake of Tom Cruise, you need hundreds, if not thousands, of photos of Tom Cruise from all angles and in all lighting environments featuring a variety of expressions. Once the training is done, there's then an inference phase. This is where you tell the machine to use its learning to generate an as yet unknown, untested output. Despite what can often be an overwhelmingly large data set, it is the inference phase rather than training that is where the vast majority of energy is used up in machine learning applications. This is in spite of outlandish claims about the environmental impact of machine learning, which, while certainly something to keep an eye on, are simply not yet backed up by fact. One such machine learning application is the YouTube recommender algorithm. Much like other recommender systems, such as that used by Netflix, the YouTube algorithm trains on millions of data points of user behaviors and preferences. And from that training, it then infers a series of suggested videos that it then places both on your YouTube homepage and to one side of whatever video you're currently watching. As Tyner Boucher, David Beer, Jonathan Cohn, and others have noted, there are great ethical and cultural questions at play here, not least of which to what extent this mode of curation is designed to keep you on a given platform and exposed to advertising. When thinking about these sorts of algorithms, though, my mind invariably turns to data centers, those cavernous, supercooled, sparsely populated, quietly whirring machine farms. YouTube's owner, Google, has over 30 extant data centers across 4 continents. These are massive structures, often hundreds of feet long. Contradicting popular belief, though, they are fairly efficient, relying mostly on fresh air for cooling. The ultimate intertwining of physical and computational architecture, a reminder that the cloud is not even close to immaterial. It is these algorithmic and ecological concerns that impressed themselves on my mind as I watched Cara Delevingne emerge from the hot pink vagina tunnel that she had installed in her Los Angeles superhouse. It was the end of a long week in lockdown 2, 4, 5, I can't really remember anymore, and my partner and I had settled in on the lounge to absorb some mindless, algorithmically curated content, and the video sommelier in the Apple TV decided that Architectural Digest celebrity house tours were the plat du jour. Weak of mind as we were, we consumed something like 10 or 15 in an evening, and we weren't alone. Wiz Khalifa's house tour has racked up 48 million views. Jessica Alba is on 31 million. Susan Downey and her husband, Robert Jr., 25 million, and Dakota Johnson, 19 million. On the other side of the design scale spectrum, more recently, the algorithm decided that we'd enjoy Never Too Small, a channel featuring architects and designers talking about how they converted very small spaces into functional, livable homes. Alongside the loft conversions of tiny Hong Kong apartments, unfolding kitchens in heritage-listed Art Deco Fitzroy blocks, a particularly affecting one for me was The Pod, a 40 square metre tiny cabin in Lewisham in southeast Tasmania. Maybe it's the idyllic location atop a ridge with panoramic views back over the peninsula to the Hobart CBD, or perhaps the considered use of materials in the construction, wood and steel, or maybe it's just that the video presents a house that I haven't been stuck in for now well over 200 days. Regardless, the episode about the Lewisham Pod struck a chord, as have the rest of Never Too Small's videos, edited dreamily with soft camera movements, a warm sound bed, and people calmly patting about barefoot, gently opening cabinetry to show off their hidden dining tables or secret bed platform ladders. Never Too Small relies in part on the continued interest in the tiny house movement. Whether that interest is serious or more incredulous doesn't matter, as long as the views keep rolling in. So successful is the small Australian-based channel that they've been able to put together and launch merchandise collaborations with artists, an interview series, and have just released a book. It is perhaps no coincidence that the story of the Lewisham Pod's construction was featured on an episode of Grand Designs Australia. The Grand Designs universe now spans Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, and the one-off abroad special from 2004, but the real MVP of the franchise is the original UK version hosted by the inimitable Kevin MacLeod, which just broadcast its 21st series, comprising 5 projects featuring the usual drinking game fodder of pregnancy, snow, and caravans, but with the added roller coaster of the pandemic thrown in. Like algorithmic computation and machine learning recommendation systems, architecture and its result, construction, are hugely labor and resource intensive. Despite the best efforts of these industries to green up, the energy outlay of the construction industry remains high. A 2017 study offered that the construction sector comprises some 18% of Australia's total carbon footprint. The same can be said of media production. There are a whole bunch of stats that I could grab here, but the one that sticks out for me is from 2019, which suggested that streaming video was responsible for 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And that estimate was pre-pandemic, when in a month from mid-March to mid-April 2020, internet usage as a whole is estimated to have increased by 40% worldwide. One could argue there is a balance to be struck between the sheer consumptive hunger of the media production, construction, and computation worlds, and I offer here that architectural media could be a large part of whatever equation results in that balance. What is it about architectural media that so fascinates and enthralls? What is it that specifically made it so popular during the pandemic, when much of the world's population had both to slow and hunker down? There is a non-academic and hugely valid answer here, which is that we were, and in the case of quite a bit of Australia's eastern seaboard, still are, all stuck inside with our own 4 walls and whoever we happen to share them with. It is no stretch to understand that looking at shiny, new, nicely designed things forms a few glorious minutes or hours of escape. But there are other points to be made here around material and embodied encounters between the cinematic or mediated and the architectural. It's long been understood that film can have a physiological effect on the body, but it was only relatively recently that such insights wove their way into the quite rigid Western, masculine, heteronormative frame of film theory. For such an intellectual and cerebral discipline, there was simply no room for feelings, and heaven forbid that such responses might actually evoke empathetic responses with those of different experience or background, and that perhaps such responses were worthy of discussion and dissection. Laura Mulvey flipped film theory back on its normativities. Linda Williams redefined the notion of spectacle to be perhaps less about violent, repulsive reactions and more about pleasure and gratification. And Lisa Cartwright developed a model for considering the complex and intimate relationship between viewer and viewed object. The powerful writing of these scholars encouraged many others, including Anne Rutherford, whose work and influence is central to much of my own thinking about how film transcends basic representation. In discussing a moment from Mizugushi's The Story of the Last Chrysanthemum, for instance, Rutherford observes a moment of stillness after chaotic editing. Quote, "Just as the rhythmic juxtapositions can lure and contort the body, the tensions and dynamisms of the surface of the image can effect a bodily agitation," end quote. The smallest reducible unit of conventional cinema, the cut, smaller even than the frame, as the cut is the indivisible non-moment joined between 2 frames from different shots. So small, invisible even, yet it can evoke extreme reactions: joy, sadness, fear, disgust, laughter, desire. Architecture can invite similar reactions. Sorry. It can inspire, it can bring joy, it can relax, it can agitate. In this way, cinema and architecture operate on a similar affectual plane. Both are designed to invite the subject in, and both repulse. In the case of visual media, because the screen is an impassable barrier, and in architecture, because its whole can arguably only fully be appreciated at a distance or abstracted in drawings. In both cases, the subject is held at a distance, and this is amplified in the case of architectural media, which, like cinema, co-opts the eyes to tease, hint, to imply texture and other haptic phenomena. As Laura Marks offers, these media work via, quote, an appeal to non-visual knowledge, embodied knowledge, and experiences of the senses, end quote. Architectural media make use of the full spectrum of camera angles and movements, with the exception of anything jerky or handheld. Movement is usually done using dollies, sliders, jibs, and more recently, external shots are nearly always taken using drones. Sound design is minimal and seamless, leaning to the naturalistic. In the Brook episode of Never Too Small, for instance, the opening is a drone shot following a couple of cows as they walk along the track next to the house. The drone then pulls up to show the house from the air. Obviously, the drone is quite noisy, so it's been replaced with gentle feet padding in mud, then pulling up to just wind and water sounds. All Never Too Small episodes feature meditative, ambient music that draws all the imagery together. Short form architectural media, particularly that found on dedicated YouTube channels, are usually product oriented. They spend a great deal of time focused on the finish, the materials as they are placed in or on the completed house. The only gesture to process is the odd mention of the build in the voiceover or the inclusion of an architectural drawing to give a sense of overall layout. In general, these media foreground what Lucy Fife Donaldson calls, quote, the materiality of space, end quote, usually the same way that cinema does, through decor, light, and bodies.
Guys, sorry.
Just mute you there, Dominic, sorry. In the case of Never Too Small videos, material possessions are sparse, scattered around the tiny homes in a naturalistic, lived-in manner. The homes are tidy, near empty, to make prominent the architectural and design elements. They are lit most often with natural light, but when this isn't possible, they've usually been designed to feature interesting lighting, so this is shot appropriately. What is also interesting is the use of people in these videos. Ostensibly, they are just in the frame to show how the space is used or transformed through opening doors or cabinetry, but they're usually barefoot, wearing neutral colors, and are moving slowly and deliberately through the space. This is theatrical costuming and blocking that complements the overall calm of the series. There are some exceptions to this sleek and seamless approach, which can usually be found in process rather than product-oriented architectural media. Kevin's site visits in Grand Designs, for instance, can often feature him pitching in to help with various aspects of the build. These are shot functionally with close-ups, mid-shots from a handheld camera, but these relatively slapdash visual moments give way, usually at the end of the episode, to these same vaulted, smooth, seamless visuals that slide and brush up against the buildings, allowing us intimate access to plane, volume, curve, and void. I'm broadly interested in, and have really only just begun to explore, architectural media's, quote, overall fabric, as Lucy Fife Donaldson calls it, quote, the total picture, which involves scrutinizing the interaction of the detail, the threads of narrative, the rhythmic relations between visual style, sound, and action, the pattern arising out of a horizontal movement or unfolding of narrative action, end quote. This paper is an opening gambit. Call it starting the groundwork or a laying of foundations for a broader thesis on connections between architecture and media. I plan on teasing out more of the haptic elements that make this connection so strong and performing more specific close readings of media objects that present built space and the design process. Why do this? As the circuitous route into this paper hinted, architectural media, perhaps like no other media content, must reliably and tangibly convey material. And in so doing, they make known both the consumptive nature of the practice of making both media and buildings, and how best to respectfully and tactfully channel that consumption. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dan. So as I mentioned at the start, for anyone who's come in, we will hold questions off till the end, but do either put them in the chat now if you've already forget about them, or make a note of them. We'll move on to Wendy Lee, who's a PhD candidate in Media and Communications at the University of Melbourne. Her PhD project is looking at young people's communication experiences and identity formation in relation to climate change. So over to you, Wendy.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen right now. Cool. Yep. So hi all, it's really great to meet up with everyone and talk about my research here today. Before everything, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I've been living and working, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and extend my respect to all the Indigenous peoples, their elders past, present, and emerging. So I was a bit anxious when I noticed I was put into this panel on post-pandemic theory, because my previous proposal was more on the practice side. So I did a bit of adjustment to my topic. It's slightly different from the proposal displayed on the website. Sorry for that, but also it's a work in progress after all. So my study sits more on the communication side, but also reveals how young citizens try to get heard and seen by using different media, especially social media. So as the title suggests, today I'm going to present this new concept of the youth-led global climate public sphere through the development of youth climate activism in Melbourne, Australia during the COVID-19 pandemic. I specifically focus on a case study of Student Voice Network, which used to be a Melbourne-based but now Australia-based youth-led virtual platform or organization advocating for actions on social justice and environmental issues, including especially climate change. So based on the interviews and online observation, I found that young climate activists from Melbourne in particular and Australia in general have tried very hard to maintain and have pretty much successfully maintained the momentum of climate activism online during the pandemic. So their practices and achievements can be related to this concept of the global climate public sphere. I take this concept further to propose this idea of a youth-led global climate public sphere by bringing together the global public sphere theory and literature on youth climate activism. Drawing on this case study of Student Voice Network, I delineate the outline of an emerging global climate public sphere comprised of critical climate discourses, primarily created, fostered, and publicized by young people who are extremely concerned about climate change. In what follows, I'll briefly review relevant literature, primarily on global climate public sphere, and then I'll cover research methods and get into discussion of the findings. Lastly, I'll focus on the case study of Student Voice Network. So in terms of the literature, I should start with global public sphere theory because that's the foundation of everything I'm going to talk about. But due to the time limit, I can only provide you with a very short introduction to it, and then I'll have to directly link it to the issue of climate change, giving rise to the notion of global climate public sphere. So during the past 2 decades, the process of globalization together with digitization has brought about unprecedented changes to public communication, leading to the emergence of such a global climate public sphere, sorry. The concept of a global public sphere in which global citizens can freely discuss common concerns has received a heated debate. It remains contested and there are multiple versions of conceptualizations of it. Nevertheless, there's this development of the global public sphere on climate change. Climate change is one of the major existential crises facing humanity, has entered the arena of such a global public sphere in very recent years. In this manner, a particular global public sphere is taking shape around the theme of climate change, revolving around critical climate discourses spanning across borders and regions. I didn't coin the term global climate public sphere. It has already existed for a year or two, but it's indeed very new. However, the existing research has concentrated on the mediated dimension with a special focus on transnational media content. It means that the current global climate public sphere has been primarily constituted by the media discourse. For example, Ivanova et al. Conduct a large-scale comparative study of media attention on climate change by analyzing climate coverage in newspapers in 27 countries. By presenting this evidence, they argue that a transnational public sphere is emerging around the issue of climate change since around like 2015. Antila et al. And Wozniak et al. Conduct similar studies drawing on news articles in different countries in 2018 and 2021, respectively. The latter also call for the broadening of research focus in the global public sphere theory to incorporate contemporary global challenges, including especially climate change. So my study would be a response to their call. In addition to the media, a few studies have also investigated the climate actions of other actors, but not citizens, of other actors on the global stage, but not citizens or the public. Actually, there is only one. So there is one study in political theory on the non-state or non-party actors, which refers to those who are not signatories to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So it includes regional governments and cities, but just not state governments. Overall, you can tell that the role of the public, especially that of individual citizens in forming this global climate public sphere, hasn't received much attention. Meanwhile, since the second half of 2018, we've witnessed the visible rise of global youth activism on climate change, led by the Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg, as everybody knows, and followed by many other young activists. The school strike movement under the banner of Fridays for Future was initiated to pressure governments into taking political actions to address climate change. It swept across the globe in 2019 with millions of young people going to the streets for climate worldwide. It can be argued that since then, facilitated by the frequent and widespread youth climate activism, climate change has entered and gained constant presence in the global public arena. Therefore, the emergence of the global climate public sphere is closely related to the rise of youth climate activism, but no research has related these two together. My study would fill the gap. I think that research on youth climate activism can shed light on the construction of the global climate public sphere. Therefore, by presenting this case study of young climate activists from Melbourne, I provide an alternative perspective to the existing construction of global public sphere on climate change. Because of the time limit, I'll pass the literature on youth climate activism and directly get into my research. I have to say that this study was not carefully planned. It is a part of my PhD project. When the unexpected COVID-19 situation disrupted my original research design, I had to shift my fieldwork in Melbourne from face-to-face to online mode after around a half year into the pandemic. Overall, I'm a qualitative person, so I adopted qualitative approaches, including semi-structured interviews and participatory observation, primarily online, as you can imagine. So I did 20-some online interviews with young people from Melbourne who are very concerned about climate change, and some of them, around 7 to 8, are climate activists. The interviews took place on a one-on-one basis between July and September 2020. Through interviews with young climate activists, I found that they adapted to online climate activism pretty well. Overall, I identified 2 approaches to online youth climate activism during the pandemic, which are consistent to their practice patterns in the pre-pandemic time. One is more disruptive and the other less contentious and more collaborative in an educative manner. So the disruptive approach refers to what they call as brand jamming. So activists would repeatedly email or call executives of big corporations, primarily big minings, to disrupt their work in order to pressure them to taking climate actions. This brand jamming was used to substitute real actions in the pre-pandemic time, including especially the blockade. However, one respondent said in the interview that although it works, quote, the phone jamming is not as effective as the direct real actions, which can significantly disrupt business economically, quote. I'm not saying that these activists who adopted disruptive tactics are not collaborative. They are collaborative within their admitted communities, but not very much so otherwise. And also, I have to acknowledge this conclusion is drawn based on my observation of a very small sample. So it has limitations. To know more about climate activist practices during the pandemic, we need to do more focused research later on. In contrast, members of Student Voice Network adopted comparatively milder and less contentious activist communication practices. I think they adjusted to the COVID-19 situation even better because Student Voice Network started as a virtual platform. So they've been pretty used to the online campaigning. I want to stress their most important feature as a youth-led community building platform or organization, which is closely linked to the theorization of a youth-led global climate public sphere. Among these members of Student Voice Network, there is a very strong sense of self-identification as youth. For example, on its website, it says very clearly that SVN is completely run by young people for young people. And it is a dedicated space for young people to work together, empower each other. There's similar description on its Instagram accounts, such as "we are completely student run." They'd also adopt the hashtags in their Instagram posts, such as hashtag youth power and hashtag youth leadership, as you can tell from the screen. During the interviews, I found them to be passionate, motivated, and self-driven. I think by creating such an active, enthusiastic, and capable image or representation, they are trying to stand up against this dominant impression of youth being the marginalized, almost invisible, and politically impotent population in the mainstream public discourse. I think they want to change this underrepresented status quo by actively representing themselves on the public arena. Moreover, I identified 3 activist communication practices adopted by members of Student Voice Network. The first is creating networked communication spaces by developing their own discourse about climate change. The second is organizing individualized yet collective actions of combating climate crisis through project development. And the last one is collaborating with like-minded publics, environmental initiatives, and green businesses. And most importantly, green businesses, on tackling climate emergency. It can be argued that Student Voice Network is contributing to the formation of a youth-led global climate public sphere through these activist communication practices. In terms of creating their own climate discourse, these young climate activists would have discussion on climate change and related stuff when they meet up in the community space. For example, when asked where and with whom would you talk about climate change, one interviewee answered, quote, "For me personally, it is usually the Student Voice Network, so we will discuss action plan, what we want to do, how we think about this issue, blah, blah, blah," quote. So during the pandemic, they managed to organize a lot of online activities. They published green magazines, held yearly online climate conferences twice, and launched climate-related educational campaigns. In doing so, they share information about climate change online, trying to promote awareness, spark discussions, and stimulate actions around the issue. More than that, they also organized individualized yet collective actions of combating climate crisis through project development. SVN has this tradition of incubating individual projects and amplifying the impacts of these projects through their networks, prompting people to take collective actions. The actions are expected to be individualized because it requires each individual to adopt this lifestyle change. And this lifestyle change wouldn't be effective if it's not happening at the collective level. So for example, one of the Student Voice Network member who is very passionate about the health of oceans started this initiative called Oceans Feed to try to raise the awareness about marine conservation. Their last activist communication practice is collaborating with like-minded partners on tackling climate emergency, including schools, researchers and research institutes, other similar youth initiatives, and most importantly, green businesses. In the Western context, activists would primarily adopt contentious practices against the businesses, whereas these young activists would prefer to work with sustainable businesses. For example, they team up with Retab, which is a sustainable brand selling reusable containers and offering swap options at appointed cafes. And Student Voice Network would have this giveaway contest on Instagram to encourage their audiences to adopt a more sustainable living style. Overall, I argue that it is through these activist communication practices that members of Student Voice Network, as young climate activists, have contributed to the formation of this youth-led global climate public sphere. Thank you. That's the end of my talk. I'll just stop here. Wait.
Thanks so much, Wendy. That was terrific. So if you've got questions for Wendy, as I said, we'll hold them off till the very end of the session. So we'll now throw over to Jan-Hendrik Bruggemeyer, who's a media artist and producer, creative practice researcher, and also lecturer in professional communication at RMIT. Jan, are you there? Do you want to take over now?
Yes, can you see my slides?
We've got the menu bar.
Yeah, we've just got the menu bar, not the actual slides.
All right, 1 second. All right, 1 second. Sorry, I'll just get out of the presenter view for a second. Here we go. Is this better?
Much. Yeah.
Yep.
All right,
Terrific.
cool.
Thanks, Jan.
All right, just check the time. All right, welcome everyone. I might just add to the acknowledgement of country, which has been already mentioned by the pre-speakers. So I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Wadawurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations. Respectfully acknowledge the ancestors, elders, past, present, and emerging. In my case, I'd add Bossarong and Gulitjan country, where I actually am located today. So just to acknowledge that under the concrete and asphalt, the land, sea, and waterways were and always will be traditional lands of the First Nations people. So my name is Jan-Hendrik Bruggemeyer, and there are a couple of my affiliations. So I work at RMIT University. I'm the coordinator of Unlikely Journal for Creative Arts and involved in a couple of other things. Today, I want to talk about what are bioregional media, what could they and what should they be. And this is research in progress, so I can't really present final findings in that sense. It's for me more an exploration of what a bioregional media practice could look like and could be. And I will unpack that as we go along. So maybe just to start off with, what are bioregions? Bioregions are large geographical distinct areas of land. It's common characteristics such as geology, landform patterns, climate, shared plant and animal communities. It has been pointed out that, for example, looking at this bioregional map of Australia, that there is an interesting overlap with the bioregions and indigenous language groups, for example. But be that as it may, so bioregions is as scientific as things can get. So it's in Australia, has been leading in the scientific space for regional spatial planning applications. And it stands, there's the interim biogeographic regionalization framework, which is based on bioregions. And the FASA, we could say, is Gesson Morgan, a Magnetic Island resident. And the idea is basically that you have the bioregion, and then you actually even can break it down further to regional ecosystems. So it gets finer scale, finer detail, more and more. The idea how is this being used and why you could consider this important is that this is reflected in the national park system in Victoria, but also across Australia, that it means for national parks, it's the highest environmental protection we have. And the national park system and therefore has to represent what we call a CAR system, which is a comprehensive, adequate, and representation of all bioregions in Victoria. What that means basically is, for example, if you look at the waters, and if you're interested in that, we produced a podcast on the founding of the system of marine national parks in Victoria in 2002, which was a world first, that you represented all the 5 bioregions, the marine bioregions of along Victoria's coasts, And that has to be captured at least twice, sort of in a way that each bioregion should be represented twice. So if you have an oil spill in one marine national park, there's still backup. So that's basically the idea of the CAR system. And that's what makes marine national parks different to, if you look at the Great Barrier Reef, for example, which is a marine park, is marine national parks are the highest environmental protection to date that we can apply to environments. So what, that comes down to is, for example, the finer grade detail of understanding of our bioregional environment is the EVCs, the ecological vegetation classes. And that's the one I live in. It's a plains, Victorian volcanic plain bioregion. And then the EVC is the plains grassy woodland, which is then described as, it's an open eucalypt woodland up to 50 meters tall, occupies poor soils, flat, gently undulating plains with low elevations, and it consists of a few sparse shrubs, species-rich grassy layer. And that's how it looks. So, so that's in a nutshell the concept of bioregions. Victor Steffensen sort of approaches from a different angle, coming from sort of traditional environment management, and he sums it up as that know your trees and know your soil in order to sort of understand the place where you are. So having mentioned that, this is sort of the scientific angle in that sense, scientific framework. Bioregionalism has been around as well. And I'm a big fan, to say the least. But Peter Burke is from the Drum Foundation, is probably one of the leading international promoters of the concept, late Peter Burke. And he sort of sums it up as that the bioregion is a geographic area defined by natural characteristics, including watersheds, very important, often in defining the landscape, landform, soil, geological qualities, native plants, animals, climate, and weather. But sort of the bioregion is a geographic terrain, but it's a terrain of consciousness. It's the cultural idea based on a characteristic usually associated with natural sciences, but put simply, the bioregion is a live place, a natural place around you that's alive and contains your life as well as the life of other species. Bioregionalism as a social movement started in the 70s and sort of draws on, back to the land movement / 70s hippie-ish, early starting of the natural conservation movement with hotspots in the Americas, Europe and Asia. The mother of all bioregions in that sense is Cascadia, and the Cascadia Now movement, sort of, which is the coastal bioregion that defines the Pacific Northwest of the United States and Canada. And it's defined through the watersheds of the Fraser and the Columbia watersheds. So, and this is a movement which is sort of a grassroots movement who sort of is set to transcend conventional arbitrary, what they call arbitrary state borders that are not reflecting the sort of geographic reality and environment on the ground. And so Cascadia has been on the forefront of this sort of bioregionalism as a social movement for sure. There has been interesting sort of cross-fertilizations, though, that if you look at Rojava in the northern Syria / Turkish border land, we can see that the leader of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, has been influenced, lately got under the influence of Morad Bookchin, which is sort of a eco-anarchist communalism / bioregionalism provocateur, we may want to call him, from the 70s onwards. And sort of interestingly, that Öcalan then married basically the Kurdistan Workers' Party with more eco-anarchist sort of communalism. And I think we all have heard about what happened from there. Sort of for me, what I'm sort of why I'm particularly interested in bioregionalism is sort of what the philosopher Val Plumwood sort of pointed out in terms of place honesty and shadow places. So in her final academic paper, Shadow Places and the Politics of Dwelling, she points out that all sort of place discourse obviously is privileging, you know, the sort of the well-rooted ones who have natural rights and stable homes, while denied, dislocated and dispossessed identities. And for her, basically the big promise of bioregionalism lie in that it creates place honesty and responsibility, which plays to her concept of shadow places, which is basically the places, our sacrificed places we have so we can live the lifestyle we want to live and don't worry about them. And it's sort of in that, you know, almost sort of Jungian twist. This comes down to, you know, owning your shadows, doing the work, owning your shadows, and also owning your colonial shadows of your spatial footprint. So from there, that's sort of a bit of the concept for my question is that what could bioregional media be? And I guess what I want to sort of, on that sort of turn into my sort of more future facing research orientation, is that I have done a lot of what you could say maybe bioregional art projects or bioregional content production. And I know it's hard to see at the background, but they are sort of produced. I already mentioned the Marine National Parks podcast series on the creation of marine national parks in Victoria, where we produced a podcast series on the 1969 dispute in Victoria about the Little Desert protest, which extended the Little Desert National Parks in 1969, but it also changed the political landscape of Victoria by eventually introducing the Land Conservation Council as a scientific independent body to advise governments on complex questions of public land use from 1971 onwards. And what the Land Conservation Council basically did is, and it hasn't been done before, is basically walk through Victoria and doing a bioregional assessment of what basically has been still left of the environment by then. Another project is the Nature in the Dark series, where we basically used camera footage and photographs which were collected by Citizen Science Project in the Bunyip State Park in the Wombat State Forest, and gave these images, which are sort of collected from within these particular parks and forests, to artists to make work, which then was projected on public screens around Melbourne, but also in the US. So the thing is that sort of what, and that's sort of one image from there, but the question that I'm more interested in and what I want to sort of move forward to is that how basically the medium, so as in the medium technology, becomes part of the art, and how that sort of reflects its bioregional nature. So in a way, one way it's beyond just looking at technology to carry that sort of message or the content. It's a question how its specific technological setting reflects bioregionalism, you know, its distribution area, production processes, which then sort of add to, you know, a bioregional imaginary. And that's where my influence comes from. That I'll finish up in 2 minutes. That I'm very influenced by the micro radio movement, radio art, where basically you build small radio transmitters, and there the technology becomes part of the art making process and the art performance in the end. So, and here are a few future areas I want to look into. Sort of Adivasi publishing in India, which is sort of tribal people, which I saw in a visit to Bangalore. I was kind of very impressed by sort of some of the small publishing housing that are publishing very interesting things. There's a bioregional ink project with the Commoners Press, where we look at actually creating seasonal inks for printing art prints. There's the idea of the solar web with the low carbon internet, where the idea is that, you know, looking, for example, at the Low Tech magazine website as a case study, where it basically runs on solar power. If there's no sun and the battery runs flat, they will go offline. But then they develop all these devices, all these content strategies in a way to deal with these situations, to make your site downloadable. But it's also about questioning the 24/7 service nature of that. And then now this is coming on the back of research by game scholar Hugh Davis, the idea of seasonal play in Japan. And this basically, there are certain regenerative practice methodology frameworks that are already existing, which are coming out of the sort of ecology scientific space, but it's also moving into sort of development work in general, where we sort of see how this could be fed into into a framework of bioregional media, which is understand the relationship with the place, design for harmony with place, and design for co-evolution. So, all right, I hope I didn't go too much over time here.
You went really well, Jan. Thanks very much.
Yeah, all right.
Can I ask if anyone has, if you wouldn't mind stopping that sharing, Jan,
Sure.
so then we can open up chat. And also, if you go into there's a little icon down the bottom saying reactions. People can put their hands up in reactions, or you can put a question. And remember, that's questions for Dan, for Wendy, and for Jan. Dan, I want to come back to you for a moment, but I can kind of see some segues here with you, Jan, so stick around. With the fact that they're using the drone footage, but then they have to, that's not aesthetically pleasing. So let's just get rid of that and put the little cow poop. What do cows have? Hooves, cow hoof noises. You know, there's something there with, you know, and then you have to have the humans in barefoot too. Like it's interesting because on the one hand, it's sort of saying, let's tread softly, but it's also we're facing the fact that they're not actually treading that softly necessarily.
No, and I've also done other work with drones, and it's actually quite cruel to use drones near animals because of the proximity sensors make use of ultrasound or infrared technology that can muck, particularly with dogs. I'm well aware of, you know, dogs don't really like having drones. So there's lots of really bizarre sort of issues and crossovers and that sort of thing. So yeah, and Adam's film that's screening later, Crash Theory, talks a little bit about intersections between drone technologies and the natural world, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, it's unusable. The audio, if the drone has audio, it's unusable because you can't hear anything apart from the propellers, obviously. So it'd be the same with a helicopter shot. Yeah.
And Dan, there's another question for you in chat from Peppy. It does make sense why we're locked down, that we're interested in seeing other architectural spaces, but can you elaborate on any ideas, thoughts you have about our attraction specifically towards little spaces?
It's a really weird one because there is we've been watching Never Too Small and Grand Designs side by side almost, which is kind of crazy because very often the majority of projects in grand designs are kind of these huge, enormous, cavernous kind of structures. I think it is potentially a little bit about the physiological response to cuteness that we have with little things. We sort of want to squeeze them, you know, it's that sort of response that we have to cute spaces. I think that's part of it. I think it's also a general increasing awareness that large places have a bigger footprint, both physical and ecological. And, you know, part of the tiny house movement is treading lightly on the earth and not using much resources. So there is kind of a romantic attraction to that. And also I think there, you know, if you're partly design minded, which, you know, I'm in no way qualified for, but I appreciate good design, there is a very satisfying quality to watching things come together neatly, and, you know, seeing hidden things and making space functional. I think there is kind of a very again, a romantic kind of view that we have towards that. And, you know, considered use of materials is always something that's very attractive, I think. Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. And I wanted to put this to both Jan and Wendy. In your respective projects, that tension between the material and the non-material, the tension between sort of like an eco-aware stance with the fact that, you know, that there is sort of a digital footprint, but also Wendy, with yours, you know, like this shift towards green consumerism, which, you know, I know has been really fraught in the movement. So I wondered if you both might want to talk to that that tension between the material and the non-material.
Do you want to go first, Wendy?
I'm not sure, actually. I think I first actually witnessed this tension in Hong Kong when I did my first half of the fieldwork in person, like, because I was still able to like adopt kind of like a face-to-face fieldwork mode. So I guess and then could you go first? So I'll just like take some time to think for a while.
Sure.
Oh yeah, sorry.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Well, just quickly. So Peter Berg speaks of re-inhabitants. So we have to re-inhabit place where we live, and it doesn't matter if it's city, urban, or rural, regional. It is, you know, so understand the place. It means know your soil, know the trees, even if there maybe aren't any trees left in that sense. You know, sort of that's the first connecting step. In that regard, there is a bit of a tension in what I come from a very scientific approach, bioregionalism. There is a sort of the permaculture sustainability discourse about bioregion, which looks at, you know, let's say, what is the footprint of the city of Melbourne to sustain its population as it stands now? And, you know, what is that sort of reach? And then they define bioregions more in the how much land is required to maintain sustained population. And there is a bit of tension with that as well. And we see that also with climate change discourse. You know, often we are not able to have more than one discourse publicly discussed. So nature conservation sort of takes a separate place between climate change mitigation often, although it's actually very linked in that sense. So we need, it would help with mitigation. And that's maybe also a bit of a media discussion issue we have, that our attention is a bit singular in that sense, and we don't see the lateral much. You know, we can't communicate it very effectively. The last thing there is why I'm siding more with a nature conservationist is I'm interested in habitat creation and not just maintaining human populations.
I agree with Jan. I think how I consider this tension, or how, especially from the young climate activists from the Student Voice Network, how they consider this tension is that they are actually interlinked, you know, the non-materiality and materiality. And I think they want to employ just all kinds of methods and try to, you know, all kinds of resources to deal with, to help us to cope with the current like situation the climate crisis, emergency context. So I think they actually provide a way to bridge the tension, the materiality and non-materiality. Although it's not very like, although, you know, it's non-normative. It's not like how we try to cope with this, you know, or how we try to deal with the relationship between like human and environment and this and that. So I think I'm expecting it to further develop and see how it goes in the future. But like, of course, green, like the best scenario would be like growth, right? Like would be like non-consumerism, but it's very hard to achieve, like realistically speaking. So yeah, I would love to see how it goes in the future in terms of like green businesses and how we deal with everything like this. Yeah.
Thanks, Wendy and Jan and Dan for all of your papers. I'm sure some other thoughts will occur to people. And so if you're around in the lunch, please, you know, say hi to each other. I do want to, in the chat, I want to end up with a Portlandia sketch on tiny houses that I just felt the need to share. But other than that, I think we're about to go back into the main room. Obviously, take the time to stretch your legs, get something to eat, maybe see if there's some sunshine out, and then come back and meet up with people and say hi, because as we know, it's coffee and chats where everything happens. All right, thanks everyone, and we'll see you a bit later.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, Jan.
Thanks, Jan and Dan and Baker.